In religious studies, you want to be very clear about the difference between an insider perspective and an outsider perspective. The academic study of religion tries as hard as possible, and can't be completely perfect, but as hard as possible to assess sources or beliefs or practices from an outsider's perspective. So you want to be able to ask yourself, how would someone who doesn't believe this perceive the usefulness or the relevance of this text or this ritual or practice or something like that. So I think that idea of determining the difference between insider and outsider. And when it comes to doing research, I think that also comes into play in a way that it doesn't, for instance, in a lot of science research. If you read something in physics, you don't have to worry so much about the author's own perspectives getting in the way. But in religious studies, when you're doing research for a religious studies course, one of the things you want to learn is how to assess an author's own perspective. Is the author writing for an insider community, that is a faith-based community? Or is the author writing for an academic community? And that's the kind of thing that you want to be able to use in your own research. Be confident enough to investigate your beliefs. It can be a very scary thing to do, but I'm optimistic enough about college to still think that's what we do in college, that the value of a college education is it gives you that opportunity to decide for yourself whether what you have grown up believing is what you really want to believe. And think about it in a variety of ways. It doesn't mean you have to abandon any of it, but learn why you believe what you believe. And one of the things I often tell my students to do, because they think they don't have beliefs about something, is write it down, reflect on it, think about how you define something. What gets in your way? When you get irritable in class, for instance, reflect on that. What is it that you bumped up against that maybe you didn't realize you cared about? Those kinds of self-reflective things, I think, go a long way in a religious studies course to just identifying the things that you believe, and then that allows you to think about them in different ways. I think I would point to the difference between an insider and an outsider perspective. If you're trying to write as an objective historian, as I like my students to try to do in my classes, then you want to learn how people thought differently in different times in different places. And I think that's a hard skill. So for instance, I teach courses in New Testament. If a student is trying to understand what the Gospel of Mark is about, but argues that Jesus is a part of the Trinity, then that student hasn't understood that the Trinity doesn't exist yet when the Gospel of Mark is written. It's a Christian doctrine that hasn't been developed yet. So I think that understanding that religious beliefs change over time, they develop over time, and that in religious studies courses we want to jump in at different moments and assess what communities are doing at different times. I think that's one of the hardest things. Another thing that's related to that is this notion that all people in all places believe. So when you write about things that it is true that Christians believe, or in all times and places, those kinds of generalizations are typically not true from a historical perspective, from a religious studies perspective. So we want to narrow in on which people and which times and which places. So I think the largest thing I would point to is overgeneralizations. Follow directions. Please follow directions. If your professor asks you to do a certain kind of essay, make sure that you understand what that is, whether it's a comparative, whether that's an analytical, whether that's a historical, those kinds of things. Follow the directions. Understand the difference between what you believe and what an author, a modern author or an ancient author believes. Respect that difference. Use verbs. Things like that. We like those. I think those are my biggest pet peeves, just not understanding the difference between your own religious beliefs and the beliefs of particularly ancient authors.